Dignity Matters.
Hello, and thank you for joining me today. I am your host, Rich Quinlan, and on today's episode of That Really Happened here on HMTV, my special guest, Patrick Quinlan, will join me for a conversation, continuing our conversation about genocide, looking at Burundi and Rwanda. So let's start with this, the what, where, and why. But just like last time, Pat, you and I sort of dove into kind of the heart of our conversation, and we had left off talking about denial. It was that final stage of genocide. We talked about how the Burundian government in 1972 denied what happened. And when you have denial, you talked about, and brilliantly, that lack of education. And education is more than just sitting in a classroom. Education is also what a government informs people. And a government denied that this ever happened. So imagine, if we possibly can, which I know you and I can't, but imagine being the relative of one of those 300,000 who may have been murdered. And then the government says, that never happened. I mean, what's the implication there? How do you think those people felt?
Well, it would probably feel like a genocide never really ended. It feels like it would probably still continue on. The pain still lives. You would probably feel very disrespected by your own nation, by your own government, knowing that some of those people probably watched their own family members be killed in front of them or taken away, never seen again. And for a government so easily to just wipe their hands and say, no, didn't happen, like you would probably never really trust your own nation again.
That's an excellent point. Because it is all about trust. And what ended up occurring just only about 3 years ago, Burundi briefly opened up a window where they began to hold public conversations about 1972. And they created what's called a TRC, which is a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And those are two very important words. We want the truth about what happened, and we also want to have some level of reconciliation within the society. Now, incredibly, this is a bizarre little story, incredibly, through a friend of mine who is a journalist in Burundi, I was actually invited to testify in front of the Burundian Senate about the research I had done concerning 1972. Now, I did not do it in Burundi. We were still in the midst of the pandemic, so I was sitting safely in my kitchen in Long Island. But as I was presenting, the camera that I was speaking to actually began to pan the room. And I was happy to see that there were many more women in the Burundian Senate than what I would have expected. But it actually came to a table of armed Burundian soldiers, full uniform, with weapons, staring into the camera as I'm talking about their genocide. I was convinced these guys could have reached through the camera and taken me out, even sitting in Long Island. It was one of the most terrifying things I've ever been through, but it speaks to what that kind of discussion is like. If you have people who were there physically and they're testifying, how do you think you're going to speak if you look out there and all of a sudden there's an army or there's a table of armed soldiers staring back at you? And how do you think that might change your your words that day, what you might have remembered about 1972?
Well, I feel like you would probably, out of nowhere, kind of forget everything that happened when you walk in and see that, things seem to not end. And that's kind of like the point I was trying to make about how the genocide might seem like it never ended when the government is so quick to deny, and also it kind of seems, as you're describing, to intimidate those who were there and know what happened, and maybe some of those guards too that were there watching were there as well, but just on a different side, the side that seems more unfavorable, and they want to keep it light. They want to keep, it under wraps. Like, they can acknowledge certain parts of it, but not the whole not the whole atrocity.
You're absolutely right. And incredibly, only about a month or so later, and I really hope this wasn't my fault, but only about a month or so later, they actually stopped those open air hearings. Mm-hmm. And so once again, what transpired in 1972 was brushed under the rug. Now, Burundi has been more open about the genocide that transpired in 1993 because that was an outgrowth of a Burundian civil war. And again, you have numbers that vary. It's somewhere around 150,000 people who are believed to have been murdered during this 1993 genocide that was an outgrowth of the Civil War. Finally, this Civil War continued even past the genocide. There was not a settlement until the year 2000, something called the Arusha Accords that actually featured, and it was really remarkable, Nelson Mandela was part of the discussions to create the peace agreement that ended the Burundian genocide. So we all know Mandela's contributions in South Africa, but he was even involved with what transpired in Burundi. But if I said to you the 100 Days of Hell in 1994 in Rwanda, do you know what I'm talking about?
Well, I know from the movie Hotel Rwanda, Don Cheadle, but from that was taught in school as well. Rwanda was brought up in school. We were shown what they could show in school, images, and talk about what transpired in Rwanda in 1993. So I would say that was a little bit more in the curriculum.
See, that's fascinating. Okay, so Rwanda, which became a topic that celebrities spoke of, Rwanda today is actually a far more stable, a much more wealthy nation than her next door neighbor, Burundi. Rwanda became known, what is sometimes labeled a donor darling, which means it's a country that's receiving a lot of donations and a lot of support. A lot of nonprofit and NGOs got heavily involved there. But do people know what started that genocide in Rwanda?
I believe most people would say that the presidential plane was shot down by I'm blanking on the name of what.
But you said shot down.
Shot down, yes, yeah.
What was the story, if you were taught, that was coming out of Rwanda initially?
I believe maybe just some sort of malfunction with the plane,
right?
And it just fell out of the sky somehow.
Yes. But, So initially, it was a terrible accident. Mm-hmm. It was a plane crash. These things happen. No, we know full well that plane was shot down. And it also included the Hutu president of Burundi. Mm-hmm. Now, that gets completely overlooked. But when that plane went down, almost instantly, we had the start of what was known as the 100 Days of Hell in Rwanda, in which over 800,000 people were murdered in about 100 days. And this was, it's different than what transpired in Burundi, because in Burundi, we were talking about the Hutu being killed by the Tutsi. In Rwanda, it was the Tutsi who were being killed. But you can change the names in any genocide you want. You can change the name, change the location. Fundamentally, we know they're largely the same. Mm-hmm. And you and I talked about dehumanization last time. But we didn't get into, how do you spread those messages? How does a government spread messages about how and why some other group are somehow less than human?
Well, that's all through propaganda. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe in Rwanda, they controlled the radio waves and completely just full media government control of what they wanted to push out. So just throughout radio, through denying people certain access to certain amenities and like making it shown that, hey, I'm better than them. I can access this while they're left outside, they're left, in the dirt. So just really through strong propaganda.
You're right. You're absolutely right. In Rwanda, it was the radio. And again, we keep making references back to how similar most genocides are. Well, go back to Nazi Germany. The radio was intentionally mass produced by the Nazis to be affordable for almost every German family. So that meant every German family would have had access to Hitler's speeches, to Himmler's speeches, to Goebbels' speeches. They would have known or they would have been told what to think. And the same was true in Rwanda. Radio was your primary form of communication. Yes, there were newspapers, of course, but radio was really the primary form, because I know it was 1994, but even TV was not as readily available to most Rwandans as certainly what we have here in the US. So radio really did set a tone. And what was done is, once again, this time it was targeting Tutsis, but they were roaches. Right? There's something less than human. There was even what was called the Tutsi Ten Commandments that said a Hutu man should never marry a Tutsi woman. You could never have intermarriage because that would contaminate the blood. Does that sound familiar?
Sounds like the Aryan race.
Exactly. They were copying Nazi language. This was the exact same game plan as we have seen in previous genocides. It happens over and over and over again. What makes Rwanda a little bit different is that there was, and this is, again, what makes it so devastating, is that there was a real intimacy to the killing. This was not government-sanctioned mass murder where people are being gunned down by the hundreds. This was neighbor killing neighbor with machetes, gardening tools. They were looking in the eyes of the people they killed. So there's this kind of unimaginable brutality that was happening in Rwanda. Now, I have to ask you, where was the U.S.?
Not paying attention, or when they were paying attention, or more so forced to pay attention, they just kind of just did the bare minimum. They just acknowledged it in a way, but support and a real presence in Rwanda wasn't found.
Now, this is really intriguing because the U.S. did know about it. You're right. We were aware from the second it happened. The Clinton administration at the time knew full well what was transpiring. Our Secretary of State at the time was a guy named Warren Christopher. And when he was asked whether or not the events in Rwanda were a genocide, he described it as being tantamount to genocide. So it looks like a genocide. It might be a genocide, but we're not going to actually use the word. And so, as the U.S. sort of stepped away, as did other nations, including France and even UN forces, really stepped back in terms of their presence in Rwanda, and this transpired for over 3 months. But the U.S. did not get involved, and some believe, the kind of the historical perspective is today, that the U.S. did not get involved because of what happened in Somalia during the early days of the Clinton administration. Do you remember what transpired in Somalia with the U.S.?
I believe that American soldiers, if I'm not mistaken, were killed in Somalia, and also very much their bodies were thrown in the street, dragged through the street, just a complete horrific act for anyone to go through, but especially for a nation like the U.S. that is so gung-ho, heavy, especially about their own military, really took offense and really went in there, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, so you referenced that the movie Hotel Rwanda helped explain a little bit about what happened there. Have you ever heard of a movie called Black Hawk Down?
Yes.
Yeah, because that was the Somalia incident. And you're absolutely right. where you had American soldiers not only killed in the streets of Mogadishu, but their bodies dragged through the streets. And this was Bill Clinton's first foray into military foreign policy, and it was disastrous. And so there's actually a slogan that's used in terms of America not getting involved in Rwanda. People called it the Somalia syndrome, that certainly Clinton was very fearful. Now, this was 1994, so this is right in the middle of his first term, and every single president, once you hit the second year of your first term, you want to get reelected to a second term. Nobody wants to be a one-termer. So there was very much a concern that if he sent American troops into Rwanda, into another African nation that most Americans, as you said, probably couldn't find on a map, well, what happens if more soldiers return home in body bags, in flag-draped coffins? What is that going to do for him politically? You hate to look at human life through that prism, but that was a significant driving point behind American foreign policy at that time. So it's an incredible tragedy. And ultimately, the U.S. did not even call what happened in Rwanda a genocide until it was done, until it was over. So it was incredibly just staggering what transpired. But ultimately, when you have countries that endure genocide and you have massive bloodshed and death and suffering, we have to then try to find some way to rebuild those countries. Now, you and I talked the last time we were together about how men, particularly men old enough to fight, which could be anything from 14 on, they're usually the primary targets. So that means who's left to pick up the pieces?
Just the women and children who've lost pretty much everything at that point.
Exactly. Now, here's one of the frustrating things. If women are generally left behind to have to try to rebuild the societies, why aren't they a greater part of the peace process and peace negotiations?
Well, I believe that the men that are left there that weren't killed off and that still hold some semblance of power just use all that power to their own ability, their own accord. So I don't think the women in Burundi or Rwanda had much of a say before the genocide, and especially after, when there's really no sense of stability. It's just going to be harder for women to even have somewhat of a say.
You're so correct. And I was doing an interview with a Burundian politician. I'm not going to mention his name. But I said to him, can you tell me a little bit about the role of women in Burundian politics? And he started to laugh. And I just said, well, I have my answer. But we know, and this is not opinion, we know from studying peace accords that peace agreements that feature women as sort of your primary or at least significant portion of the discussion are 35% more likely to last. Right? So we know that women experience genocide very differently from men. Not only the types of crimes that are committed upon women are very different, but women, if they're the majority of the survivors, they now have to not just take over the jobs that men formerly held, but they're now rebuilding the society. But yet there's still this belief and effort, and you mentioned it, by men to retain that power and deny women an opportunity to rebuild the country that the men destroyed. We didn't see women leading these genocides. Yes, women have been involved. We're not absolving all of them, including there were women in Rwanda who were involved. But certainly overwhelmingly, it's women who are left behind. And so we have to begin, I think, to reimagine what peace deals and what peace negotiations and what truces really look like to make sure that there's a greater female presence. Or else, what do you think we're going to run into?
I mean, as we said last time, I feel like, I mean, you said history kind of like rhymes together, doesn't repeat, but I think it would lead to something like that. It would just happen all over again. I don't think they would learn, or if, we would learn to say it better, but I think it would just happen all over again, or it just would not last. It just would not stick.
Because women are obviously, they are the future of the country. They produce the future of these nations. And to deny them seats at the table is denying a critical component of your nation's population from actually progressing. And what we have seen, and this is true in Burundi, and this is true in Rwanda as well, that groups of Hutu and Tutsi women, they come to meet, and they will sit and imagine sitting across the room is maybe the mother or the wife of someone who killed someone in your family. But having worked with people who have been part of these groups, they told me that within only a couple of hours, women are singing, they're sewing, they're crying together. They have this incredible understanding, to your earlier point, that it's about the nation. It's about the country. It's not about any particular group. So there is hope. There is hope. And I know, what you and I have talked about is so dark and so distressing that it's easy for people to give up, right? I mean, and if you were to sort of provide or come up with one suggestion, one idea, some kind of positive closing message for people, what would you say? Why do you think people continue to work to prevent genocide when it seems like time and time and time again, those of us who want to stop it, it just keeps happening?
Well, I believe that genocide is always, no positive outcome, regardless, flat. Whenever genocides occur, it's always because there is that, as we said before, that classification, dehumanization, knowing that, as you made the point, that, in a couple hours, women are singing together. The woman sitting across from them could have killed their husband, but they know that if it was them in charge or their idea, that wouldn't have happened. Yeah. They know that it's only because of just some idiotic idea that we're different from each other.
Right.
So I think it's important to keep talking about genocide and to really understand that it's all just because we just force these differences on each other.
That's perfectly said. And we're on something called Humanities Matters. And I think this is one of the key ideas to understand about genocide, that when genocide occurs somewhere, it's not just an issue that affects that particular group. It's not just the Hutu in Burundi or the Tutsi in Rwanda. It's all of humanity. That genocide, hate, whether it is anti-Semitism, whether it is any kind of bigotry, is humanity's problem. And it's up to humanity to address it collectively. Because you're right, we're all here together. And we can either find ways to cooperate and understand that differences are a smaller component of who we are, that most people have more similarities than differences. There's a 21-year-old right now in Burundi who wants a job, wants a future, wants to start a family, wants to live a happy life. No different than you. And so we have to begin to get away from classification, because classification can lead to genocide, but then we continue to classify even after genocide, instead of thinking much more collectively about what our humanity is. And I think that is, if we can leave people with one idea, it is that genocide, war, hate, bigotry, ignorance, it affects all of humanity. And we all have a responsibility to try to prevent it from happening. So Thank you, Patrick. And thank you for tuning in to this episode of That Really Happened on HMTV. I appreciate my guest, Patrick Quinlan, one more time for sharing insights on genocide and also the future of our world. Be sure to subscribe, share, and stay connected for more engaging conversations. Until next time, please take care and be well.